Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box. Well, Jimi Hendrix is without a doubt the guitar player most famous for dying at a young age, right at a time when he was becoming ever more musically adventurous and going off into territories of excitement and virtuosity hitherto unknown. But while Hendrix died at 27, another famous guitar player who died at the age of 25 had a lot in common insofar as he was really hitting an artistic peak that would have taken him to new and interesting unknown places at the age of 25. And this, of course, is Tommy Bolin. Now, Bolin was entirely self taught and at a young age landed himself in a professional band out of Colorado called Zephyr. They were a blues based hard rock band with female vocals that sat somewhere on the timeline between Jefferson Airplane and Heart. Really interesting band. He next became involved in the James Gang. This was long after Joe Walsh, the great Joe Walsh, left, and Bolin ended up writing just about all the material on the Bang album, and in my view, the even more quintessential Miami album. You might recognize it with because of its famous black cover with the pink flamingo at the bottom. Very, very iconic. But Bolin's heart was really in the world, not of rock and roll, but of jazz fusion. He had the chops, he had the vigor, he had the dexterity, he had the virtuosity, he had the soul. And he got his big break in terms of this genre when in 1973 he got a call from one of the great drummers of all time, Billy Cobham, to play on his album Spectrum. Now, this album was a collaboration of sorts with Billy Cobham on the drums, and he was alongside his fellow Mahavishnu Orchestra member, Jan Hammer, on the keyboards. It also featured the great bass player Leland Sklar, known as much for his long beard as for playing a lot with the great Phil Collins. This album became an instant classic. And the song Stratus in particular became one of the quintessential jazz fusion songs. Some would argue the absolutely prototypical and best, most concise jazz fusion song. Boland's journey into this world of jazz fusion continued because then he got a call from one of the other great jazz fusion drummers of all time and one of the great drummers, full stop, of all time. This was, of course, Alphonse Mouzon. His name it should be known alongside Billy Cobham, Lenny White, Tony Williams as one of the big four of the jazz fusion drum world, an absolute genius of the drums. And he played on Alphonse Mouzon's Blue Note album, Mind Transplant. Lee Retinow, a young Lee Retinow, was also on guitar on this album. And so you could see that Bolin was working his way into the ranks of the most respected, most popular, most talented jazz fusion musicians on the planet, and things were going rather well for him. He then recorded his first solo album called Teaser, and this had all sorts of great musicians ranging from Jeff Porcaro to Glenn Hughes, who had joined Deep Purple a few years earlier for the famous Mark III lineup. Now, it was there that Bolin first came in contact with the wider Deep Purple universe. And then in 1974, when Ritchie Blackmore got fed up, it was really 75, but it was in 74 that they recorded the Deep Purple Stormbringer album. And after the tour, Blackmore said, "I've had enough." And so Deep Purple were at a fork in the road, and they had to decide, what are we going to do? Are we going to carry on with a new guitar player or call it quits? Well, the decision was made to bring in Tommy Bolin, and they recorded an excellent album called Come Taste the Band. Now, this album was at the time, and to some extent still is, controversial among Deep Purple aficionados. This is because Ritchie Blackmore, along with John Lord and Ian Pace, were sort of the consistent three members of Deep Purple up to that point. And between Blackmore and Lord, they were really the principal writers of the band. That changed partly with Deep Purple Mark III because the sound was different, because you had David Coverdale on vocals, Glenn Hughes on bass, and also on vocals. But the songwriting team of Blackmore and Lord remained. Now, one of them, arguably the most important, Ritchie Blackmore, was gone. And so John Lord sort of lost his proverbial musical right hand because they worked so well together. But rather than try to do what Blackmore and Lord had done, the new combination of Tommy Bolin, Glenn Hughes, David Coverdale, John Lord, and Ian Pace really reinvented the band's sound even more than in the Mark III lineup. They went in a much more funky, almost at times jazzy direction. And while the hard rock edge was definitely there, it was much more of a funk rock album. And some Deep Purple fans thought it was a bit too much of a stray from the normal path that Deep Purple had been on. But it's an example of one of these albums that was sort of a hostage to its name. If you had these great musicians record this album under a different name, let's say, I don't know, the Bolin, Lord, Coverdale, Pace, Hughes Band, for instance, it would have been just as good an album, and people would have been able to approach it with fresh ears. But it wouldn't have gotten the notoriety because the Deep Purple name was a brand, just like all bands that have famous names are a brand. So because it was sold as a Deep Purple album, it obviously got more sales than it probably would have if it were called something else. But the album on its own merits is fantastic. It's a great funky hard rock album. And this was because not only of the influence of Bolin, but also because of Glenn Hughes, who always had a real funky side to him, but he continued to delve into that more and more, whether it was his bass playing or his vocal work, which was very reminiscent of Stevie Wonder, a very similar style. Very talented vocalist, Glenn Hughes. He calls himself the voice of rock, but he's really, in many ways, the voice of funk rock. One of the voices, because there are, of course, a lot of talented people in all of those worlds. The tour that Deep Purple went on with the Come Taste the Band lineup was quite chaotic. The band almost got arrested in Indonesia after a fight between an unknown assailant and a bodyguard working for the band. Glenn Hughes, in particular, was in big trouble there. And then, prior to the tour in Japan, Tommy Bolin fell asleep on his hand and temporarily paralyzed its ability to move, which meant that John Lord was playing a lot of the guitar lines in addition to what he would have normally played on the organ. And so there were some great shows, though, in that tour. For instance, they played at the famous Long Beach Arena, and that concert was preserved. It was recorded on multi-track tape, and it's subsequently been released. And that's really an example of this Deep Purple Mark IV lineup at its finest, with Bolin playing healthily. The band, though, broke up after the tour. There was too much chaos, too much drugs. That was mainly from Bolin and Glenn Hughes, and they all went their separate ways. Bolin then reconvened to record his second solo album, Private Eyes, which was really great, but he unfortunately died of a heroin overdose on the tour in support of that album. What really is incredible about Tommy Bolin is that although he was only a professional musician for a short period of a very short life, he really accomplished a lot, playing with Billy Cobham and Alphonse Mouzon on two of the really great, and I mean really great, jazz fusion albums of all time, and then joining Deep Purple and helping them to reinvent their sound in a really cool way. And that's in addition to the great work he did with James Gang and earlier Zephyr. He really accomplished a lot. Of course, whenever someone dies at 25, let alone someone so deeply in the public eye, the question of what could have been always looms large. And for Bolin, I think it would be safe to say that he would have gotten even more adventurous, more fusiony, more funky, while maintaining that ability to really rock out. The great guitarists of this genre were able to do both, and Bolin really was. He was equally comfortable playing funky hard rock as playing with the great jazz fusion artists of the golden decade, the 1970s, of jazz fusion, and arguably of rock as well. It's sad that he died prematurely. A lot of great musicians, including his musical brother, have been helping to preserve his legacy. Glenn Hughes, a very close friend of Bolin, has also done great work to preserve the Tommy Bolin legacy. And luckily, we do have him on record, some of the best records frankly, of all time. And that is a great legacy, albeit a shorter legacy than it should have been. Definitely check out all of Tommy Bolin's albums, from the solo work to the Alphonse Mouzon to the Billy Cobham to the Deep Purple to the James Gang Zephyr. Check it all out. You won't be disappointed. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.